You scroll through your morning feed, another year begins, and the same resolutions repeat in your mind. Lose weight, save more money, be happier. But beneath the noise of self-improvement culture, something else quietly rises, a soft exhaustion. Not the kind that comes from working too hard, but from wandering too long without direction. Your days blur together. You wake up, move through routines you don't remember choosing, then fall back into bed wondering where the time went. Nothing feels completely wrong, yet nothing feels truly right. Buddhism teaches that most suffering doesn't arrive with alarms or dramatic moments. It comes quietly, through many small acts of neglect. You trade presence for distraction. You trade clarity for comfort. You step away from the life happening now for the life you promise yourself later. And slowly, without realizing it, you become a stranger in your own life. The habits you are about to learn are not about changing who you are. They are about waking up, not to a perfect life, but to the life you already live. Because the real problem is not that you need to become someone new, it's that you've lived on autopilot for so long, you've forgotten what it feels like to be truly awake. These 10 Buddhist practices won't make 2026 magical, but they might make it real. And sometimes reality is exactly the medicine a drifting mind needs. 1. Contemplating regret. Seeing life from the far shore, you make 100 small decisions every day without thinking about them. Hit snooze, skip the conversation, postpone the difficult thing, choose comfort over courage, and each choice feels insignificant in the moment. But Buddhism teaches something most people spend their whole lives avoiding. Every choice you make today is shaping the person you'll be when you reach the end. There's an ancient Buddhist practice called death contemplation, not to create fear, but to create clarity. The Buddha often asked his students to reflect on mortality, not because he wanted them to feel morbid, but because he understood that nothing cuts through confusion faster than the truth of impermanence. When you imagine yourself at the end of your life looking back, the trivial falls away immediately. The arguments that consume your energy today become background noise. The approval you chase loses its grip. The fear that keeps you small reveals itself as smoke. The Buddha said, "Of all the footprints in the jungle, that of the elephant is supreme. Of all mindfulness practices, mindfulness of death is supreme." This isn't just poetic language, it's practical wisdom, because when you stop pretending you have unlimited time, your priorities clarify themselves. Before making any major decision, ask yourself this simple question: if this life were nearing its end, would I regret not taking this step? Notice what happens in your body when you ask that. Fear feels loud in the present moment. It screams about what could go wrong, what people might think, how you might fail. But truth becomes simple when seen from the far shore. Regret doesn't come from trying and failing. Regret comes from never trying at all. Imagine yourself at 80, looking back at the choice you're facing right now. What does that older, wiser version of you wish you would do? Not what feels safe, not what looks impressive, what aligns with the life you actually want to live? That question cuts through months of overthinking in seconds. There's a Buddhist parable about a man who spends his whole life building a perfect house. He measures every detail, plans every room, waits for the ideal materials, but he never actually starts construction. He dies surrounded by blueprints, having never lived in the home he dreamed of. His ghost wanders the empty lot, whispering to anyone who will listen, "Start now, even with imperfect materials, even with uncertain plans, because a real house built imperfectly is better than a perfect house that exists only in your mind." This practice isn't about dwelling on death. It's about using death as a lens that reveals what actually matters. You don't need to meditate in graveyards or visualize your own corpse. though some Buddhist practitioners do exactly that. You just need to stop pretending you have forever, because you don't. And the moment you truly feel that truth, not as a concept, but as a reality, your life begins to reorganize itself around what's essential. 2. Letting go of one attachment, cutting one cheap dopamine loop. Buddhism teaches that not all desire causes suffering. The desire to grow, to understand, to love deeply, these are natural expressions of being alive. But unconscious craving always drains the mind. And in 2026, you're drowning in designed cravings. Your phone knows you better than you know yourself. It feeds you exactly what will keep you scrolling, not what makes you happy, what keeps you hooked. Pick one thing, just one, something you reach for automatically when your mind gets uncomfortable. Maybe it's checking your phone 40 times before noon. Maybe it's the third scroll through social media at midnight when you should be sleeping. Maybe it's the snack you don't even taste because you're eating while staring at a screen. Maybe it's the news cycle that makes you feel informed but leaves you anxious and powerless. The practice isn't about becoming a monk who owns nothing. It's about releasing just one addictive habit that you know deep down is stealing your energy, because your mind is not weak. Your mind is simply being overstimulated by systems designed to capture your attention and sell it to the highest bidder. When you let go of one unconscious craving, something shifts immediately. Space appears, not physical space, but mental spaciousness. Suddenly you notice the quality of light coming through your window. You hear the texture of silence. You feel your own breath without needing to fill every second with input. This is what Buddhism calls renunciation, not deprivation, but freedom. Freedom from the endless hunger that can never be satisfied. You know which habit drains you. You've known for a long time. You just haven't admitted it, because letting go feels like losing something. But what you're actually losing is the thing that's been stealing your presence, and what you gain is yourself. 3. Meeting difficulty early. Practicing effort without avoidance. Buddhism speaks of right effort, one of the essential steps on the path to freedom. Right effort doesn't mean working harder. It means meeting what needs to be met without running away from it. And here's what most people don't realize. The pain is rarely in the task itself. The pain lives in avoiding it all day long. You wake up knowing there's something difficult waiting. A conversation you need to have, a decision you need to make, a project that requires focus. And instead of meeting it directly, you spend the entire day carrying it like a weight on your shoulders. You check your phone, you make coffee, you reorganize your desk, you do 17 small tasks that feel productive, but are really just sophisticated forms of avoidance. And by the time you finally face the difficult thing, you're exhausted from running. The Buddha taught his students to cultivate energy toward wholesome action, not frantic energy. Steady energy, the kind that doesn't panic in the face of resistance. Right effort means recognizing when your mind is trying to escape discomfort and choosing to turn toward it instead. When you meet difficulty early in the day, something remarkable happens. The rest of your hours feel lighter. Your mind stops gnawing at itself. You're no longer carrying the weight of the thing you're avoiding. Even if the difficult task goes poorly, you're free from the exhausting burden of procrastination. Think about the last time you finally did the thing you'd been putting off for weeks. Remember the relief that flooded through you afterward. Not because it went perfectly, but because you stopped running. That relief is always available. You just have to choose it before the day gets away from you. There's a teaching in Buddhism about the monk who practices with the understanding that death could arrive between one breath and the next. Not to create anxiety, but to create urgency. Not panic, but presence. If you knew you only had today, would you spend it avoiding the thing that matters most? 4. Reviewing the mind before sleep, not carrying the day into dreams. Most people collapse into bed at night and immediately reach for their phone or television. Anything to avoid the silence, anything to keep the mind occupied until sleep finally forces it to stop. But Buddhism teaches a different way. Before sleep, instead of distraction, ask yourself quietly, where did my mind wander today? Did I cause harm, intentionally or not? What could soften tomorrow? This isn't about judgment. It's not about beating yourself up for every mistake or replaying arguments until you can't sleep. It's about bringing gentle awareness to the way you move through your day. Where were you present? Where did you disappear into reaction? Where did old patterns take over without you noticing? An unexamined day often becomes a restless night. Your mind keeps churning because it never processed what happened. Thoughts loop, conversations replay, worries spiral. But when you take 5 minutes before sleep to simply review, acknowledging what arose without clinging to it or pushing it away, the mind settles naturally. You don't need a formal meditation practice for this. You don't need to sit in lotus position or light incense. You just sit on the edge of your bed and breathe. Let the day pass through your awareness like scenery through a train window. Notice what stands out. Notice where you feel tension. Notice what you're carrying that doesn't need to be carried into tomorrow. The Buddha taught that awareness is the foundation of all transformation. You can't change what you don't see. But when you bring gentle, honest attention to your patterns, they begin to loosen on their own, not through force, through recognition. This practice also teaches you something essential. You are not your worst moment. You are not the mistake you made this afternoon or the conversation you wish you could redo. You are the awareness that can observe all of it without being destroyed by it. And that awareness becomes stronger every time you practice looking clearly at what is rather than what you wish had been. 5. Moving the body daily. Treating movement as a form of practice. Buddhism doesn't separate body and mind the way Western thinking often does. The body is not a vehicle carrying around your brain. The body is where your mind lives. And when energy stagnates in the body, the mind becomes foggy, restless, anxious. Movement is not about fitness. It's about keeping life force flowing. You don't need a gym membership or a perfect workout routine. You need to move every single day, even when you don't feel like it, especially when you don't feel like it. Because showing up, even when resistance is screaming in your ear, that's where real steadiness gets built. Walk for 20 minutes, stretch on your living room floor, dance to one song, do 10 push-ups. The specifics don't matter as much as the consistency. Buddhist monks don't exercise for aesthetics. They move because they understand that a settled body helps create a settled mind. When you commit to daily movement, you're not just training your muscles. You're training your capacity to do difficult things without negotiating with yourself. You're teaching your mind that resistance doesn't get to make the decision. You do. There's a famous Buddhist story about a student who asked his teacher how to develop discipline. The teacher told him to do 100 prostrations every morning, full body bows, forehead to the ground, standing back up every single day. The student complained, "But that will be so hard. What if I don't feel like it?" The teacher smiled. "That's exactly the point. Discipline isn't doing things when you feel like it. Discipline is doing things especially when you don't feel like it. Because that's when the real training happens. Your body knows things your thinking mind doesn't. When you move, tension releases, stagnant emotion shifts, clarity emerges. Not because movement solves your problems, but because movement creates space for solutions to appear. This is one of the most accessible practices in Buddhism. You don't need a teacher. You don't need special equipment. You just need to move every day without exception. recognizing what is growing, practicing rejoicing in good. The mind remembers mistakes easily. It replays failures on an endless loop. It catalogues every embarrassing moment, every harsh word, every decision you regret. But it must be trained to notice what is quietly improving. Buddhism calls this practice mudita, appreciative joy. It's the deliberate cultivation of gladness for what's going well, even when well means tiny incremental progress. Once a week, sit down and acknowledge 3 things you did with care. Not things you accomplished, not achievements you can post online, things you showed up for with intention. Maybe you had a difficult conversation without shutting down. Maybe you noticed anger rising and didn't act from it. Maybe you chose to be kind when it would have been easier to be cold. These quiet victories matter more than any external success. Most people walk through life blind to their own growth because they're measuring themselves against impossible standards. But growth doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It appears in small moments of choosing differently than you would have chosen 6 months ago. It shows up when you catch yourself in an old pattern and gently redirect. It emerges when you stay present through discomfort instead of numbing out. When you train yourself to notice what's growing, your relationship with yourself begins to change. You stop treating yourself like a problem that needs fixing. You start seeing yourself as a work in progress, worthy of patience and respect. This isn't toxic positivity. It's not pretending everything is fine when it's not. It's balanced awareness, seeing clearly what needs attention while also honoring what's already working. The Buddha taught that all beings have Buddha nature, the inherent capacity for awakening, but that capacity gets buried under layers of self-judgment and harsh criticism. Mudita practice excavates it. It reminds you that you're not as stuck as you think. You're not as hopeless as your inner critic claims. Small things are shifting, and those small shifts, when nurtured with attention, become the foundation for larger transformation. 7. Speaking what you learn, allowing wisdom to enter daily life. Buddhism distinguishes between 3 levels of understanding: hearing the teaching, reflecting on the teaching, and practicing the teaching until it becomes embodied wisdom. Most people stay at level 1 their whole lives. They read books, listen to talks, collect insights, but insight that cannot be spoken simply in your own words has not yet settled into your body. Try this. Once a week, explain something you're learning to someone else. It doesn't have to be formal teaching. It can be a conversation over coffee, a text message to a friend, a journal entry written as if you're explaining to your younger self. When you attempt to put wisdom into plain language, you immediately discover where your understanding is solid and where it's still conceptual. Teaching forces you to clarify. It reveals the gaps in your knowledge. It makes abstract ideas concrete, and it creates a feedback loop where understanding deepens through articulation. This is why Buddhist teachers often say that they learn more from teaching than their students do from listening. You don't need to become a teacher. You don't need a platform or followers. You just need to practice speaking what you're discovering, because wisdom that stays locked in your head becomes theoretical. Wisdom that moves through your voice becomes alive. There's a Buddhist principle called dana, generosity, and one of the highest forms of generosity is sharing insight that might help someone else find their way, not imposing your truth on others, not preaching or converting, simply offering what you've learned in case it resonates. Even if the only person listening is your future self, reading back through old journal entries and recognizing how much has shifted since you wrote them. 8. 1 hour of stillness daily, protecting the mind from fragmentation. You don't need long retreats. You don't need to disappear into the mountains for weeks. You need 1 hour without being pulled in 17 directions. 1 hour where your attention stays with one thing, not multitasking, not checking notifications, not switching between tabs, one focused hour. That's all. Buddhism teaches that concentration is the foundation of clarity. When attention stays with one thing, the mind settles. When the mind settles, you start to see what's actually happening beneath the surface noise. But in 2026, sustained attention has become a radical act. Everything conspires to fragment you. Emails, messages, news, entertainment, endless input designed to keep you stimulated but never satisfied. Choose 1 hour. It can be early morning before the world wakes up. It can be late at night when everything goes quiet. It can be your lunch break where you actually step away from screens. During that hour, do one thing completely. Read without your phone nearby. Write without checking your email. Cook without background television. Sit in silence and follow your breath. Walk outside and actually notice your surroundings. At first, this will feel impossible. Your mind will scream. It will create emergencies. It will convince you that you're missing something crucial. That's not reality. That's addiction. The addiction to distraction, to stimulation, to the illusion of productivity that comes from doing 12 things badly instead of one thing. When attention stays with one thing, clarity follows. You begin to notice patterns you've been too scattered to see. You recognize the difference between genuine need and compulsive habit. You feel the texture of your own aliveness instead of experiencing life second-hand through screens. The Buddha taught monks to develop concentration through breath meditation, one breath at a time. When the mind wandered, gently return. No judgment, no force, just the patient practice of bringing attention back. That same principle applies here. 1 hour, one focus. When your mind wanders, and it will, you gently guide it back. Not with violence, with kindness. This practice doesn't just give you a peaceful hour. It trains your capacity for sustained attention, and that capacity becomes the foundation for everything else. Because when you can't focus, you can't solve problems, you can't create, you can't connect deeply. You're always skimming the surface, never going deep enough to discover what's actually there. 9. Living backward from meaning. Letting values shape the day. Most people plan their days around what needs to get done, tasks, obligations, responsibilities. But Buddhism teaches a different approach. Instead of asking, "What must I do tomorrow?" ask, "What kind of day would leave my mind clear at night?" Let that answer shape your choices. This flips the entire process. You're not starting with the external demands and trying to fit your life around them. You're starting with the quality of mind you want to cultivate and letting your actions flow from that intention. This is what Buddhism calls right intention. Not rigid rules, but clear values that guide how you move through the world. Maybe clarity means starting the day with 20 minutes of stillness instead of scrolling through news. Maybe it means having one real conversation instead of 10 superficial exchanges. Maybe it means completing the difficult task first, so you're not carrying it all day. Maybe it means saying no to the meeting that drains you, and yes, to the walk that restores you. When you live backward from meaning, your days stop feeling accidental. You're no longer at the mercy of whatever grabs your attention loudest. You're making deliberate choices based on what you actually value. And here's what happens. You discover that you have more control than you thought, not over external circumstances, over how you respond to them. There's a Buddhist teaching about the monk who was asked how he remained so peaceful despite living in chaotic times. He said, "I don't argue with reality. I simply notice what is. I accept what cannot be changed. And I place my energy where it truly belongs, on what I can influence, which is always and only my own mind." Living guided by meaning doesn't make life easier. It makes life more intentional. And intentional living, even when it feels hard, creates a peace that comfort-seeking can never offer, because you are no longer betraying yourself by drifting through days that don't reflect who you truly want to be. Then saying no with kindness becomes a practice, using your time with care. Not every opportunity is a gift. Some opportunities only pull the mind in too many directions. Buddhism teaches ethical restraint, not as a punishment, but as a form of protection. Your time is limited. Your energy is not endless. And when you say yes to everything, you are really saying no to what matters most. You are saying no to yourself. Learn to say no with kindness, not defensively, not with long explanations, just clearly and gently, without guilt. Thank you for thinking of me, but I can't take this on right now. That is enough. You do not owe anyone a long explanation for protecting your time. Western culture often teaches that saying yes makes you kind, helpful, and valuable. But Buddhism also teaches that saying no can be an act of compassion. Compassion for yourself by respecting your limits, and compassion for others by not agreeing to things you will later resent or do poorly because you are stretched too thin. A clear no is often kinder than a hesitant yes. When you say yes out of guilt or pressure instead of true willingness, resentment enters the exchange. That resentment weakens whatever you are doing. But when you say no with honesty, you leave space for someone who can say yes with a full heart. The Buddha gave precepts to his monastic students, simple guidelines for living in a way that supports awakening. These were not random rules. They were safeguards, boundaries that helped practitioners avoid spreading their energy in ways that did not serve their deepest purpose. You also need precepts for your time, clear limits on where you will and will not place your energy. Not because you are selfish, but because your presence, your clarity, and your ability to fully show up for what matters most all need protection. Each time you say yes to something that goes against your deepest values, you are saying no to what truly matters. In conclusion, you don't need to practice all 10 at once. The Buddha never demanded perfection. He asked for honest effort. He asked for the courage to try, to stumble, and to begin again. These 10 habits are not a checklist you must complete to earn peace. They are invitations, simple ways to meet life with more awareness and less drifting. You don't need to take on all 10. In fact, trying to do everything at once is often the fastest way to do nothing at all. Choose one, just one. The one that speaks to you most when you read it. The one that makes you feel uneasy because you know it's what you've been avoiding. Begin there. Hold it gently. Practice it each day. Let it slowly become familiar. And when it feels natural, when it no longer takes great effort, then think about adding another, but never at the cost of the first. It's better to practice one habit steadily for a year than to try 10 for a week and drop them all. The path to clarity is not built on big dramatic actions. It is formed by small, repeated choices that gradually change how you move through life. Each time you face difficulty instead of running from it, you're building a new habit. Each time you notice what is growing instead of only what is broken, you're reshaping how you see the world. Each time you choose stillness instead of constant stimulation, you take back your attention from the things trying to pull it away. Buddhism teaches that real change happens in the space between a trigger and your response. That small moment, where you can choose differently than you always have, is where true transformation begins. These habits help widen that space. They give you time to pause, to breathe, and to respond with clarity instead of reacting from old patterns. You don't need a new year. You need a mind that stops running, a heart that stops chasing what never satisfies, and a life that reflects what you truly value, not what you think you should want. These habits don't point toward perfection, but toward presence, not toward a future enlightened version of yourself, but toward the person you have always been, quietly waiting to be seen. One habit, practiced gently and consistently, can slowly redirect an entire life, not by changing who you are, but by revealing who you have always been beneath the noise. And sometimes, that simple realization is all the change you ever needed. Ask yourself which practice speaks to you right now. The one that makes you uncomfortable is often the one you need the most. Start today, not tomorrow, not when everything feels perfect, but now. Because the real problem was never lack of time. It was waiting for someday to begin, and someday is where dreams slowly disappear. If this message touched something inside you, share it with someone who may also feel lost or tired of drifting. Leave a comment and tell me which habit you're choosing. And if you want more Buddhist wisdom for modern life, subscribe. Clarity isn't something you find. It's something you grow, one small practice at a time.